Welcome to day 2 of WTS Symposium. I'm really excited to be here today. My name is Gregory Skinner. I work for a company called Escalant, which is a global advisory service and consultancy. If you were here yesterday, you would have seen me do a presentation on mobility. If you haven't, please go back and watch that. But I'm really excited to have a great panel here today. Our topic here today is new energy policy and the substantial opportunities for growth, which is a big deal. Certainly there's a lot of legislation and regulation that's making its way into the system, which in some ways curtails the enterprise opportunities that exist out there, but certainly it opens up a lot of different avenues for the future. We've got a great panel here today. I'm going to introduce them one by one and let them talk about who they are, and then we're going to get into it. Just sort of going across the top of the screen, my first panelist is Nate Shadoin from NextEra. Nate, you want to give us a quick intro?
Sure, thank you. Nate Shadoin, NextEra Energy. I work in business development, and we have a new division called Mobility, and it's focused on electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So the past 7 or 8 years, I was spent in the automotive industry working for a fleet management company and leading their efforts in helping new and existing clients make the transition from combustion vehicles to electric vehicles. And I joined NextEra about 6 months ago, and the mobility division that we work for is focused on commercial and industrial and also municipal clients who are looking for large-scale charging infrastructure as they scale up and move in the direction of electrification.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Next to Nate, we have John Strisower.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here as well. My name is John Strisower. I'm the founder of Kilows, and we are building a nationwide ultra-fast EV charging network, really building for the future, where we are predicting that there's going to be a much greater need for very high performance charging.
Perfect. Next we have Laurel Moorhead. Oh, you're on mute, Laurel.
Thank you.
Someone had to do it. It was you.
I'm Laurel, and I'm employed with Transfer Flow, and we manufacture liquid fuel systems. We've been in business for 40 years in Northern California. In 2016, we were the California Small Business of the Year recognized by the California State Legislature. And my job here at Transfer Flow is I'm the regulatory compliance engineer. So my job takes 2 parts. One part is to make sure that all of our systems are legal for sale. And the other part is that I engage in all the regulatory activities. So I show up in all the rulemaking activity in Sacramento, and I represent the company's best interests.
Perfect. Thank you, Laurel. And then last but not least, of course, we have Boyce.
Thanks so much, Gregory. Thanks everyone for the time this afternoon. So I am also, like Gregory, with Escalant. My role is as sector lead for Powertrain innovation and energy transformation. And I work across both our auto and mobility and energy groups and lead a couple of studies, one of them called EV Forward, looking at kind of the next generation of e-mobility, another one called Cogent Syndicated, which is utility customer experience, brand, product, and marketing, but really am the subject matter expert within Escalant around those kinds of topics.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Casey. So what I'm going to get each of you to do, if you could just spend a real quick minute, maybe no more than a couple of minutes, talking about the areas in which you specialize and sort of that dovetail into our topic today, which is opportunities. Now, Casey, I'm going to get you to kick it off, and you're going to talk a little bit about sort of coming in at a mid-level, so not too high, not too low, regulations and policy that are coming down the pipe, like let's say Inflation Reduction Act, that are going to have an impact on this market going forward.
Yeah, so there is definitely a lot that's happening on the policy front. I will caveat this at the outset by saying I am not an accountant, and you should probably check with yours if you want to take advantage of any of the things that I'm going to mention here. But let me actually start with 2021 when the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act passed. That included about $7.5 billion for EV charging. That's being primarily distributed through a program called the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, or NEVI. And those programs are run by the states and have all been approved by the Department of Energy at this point. So money is starting to flow. And it's really focused on public charging and specifically high-speed charging. And there's some requirements for it in terms of, how many units and how high power, how, frequently you find them along corridors, things like that. And the reason that this is relevant to fleets and commercial vehicles is that Escalant's Fleet Advisory Hub study found that about 3/4 of fleets that are adopting EVs currently use public charging as at least part of what they do. So the availability of public charging infrastructure is really important for enabling fleets to be able to make the transition to e-mobility. The next one up, and Gregory mentioned it, is the Inflation Reduction Act, which passed earlier this year. That includes about $13 billion for EV incentives. A lot of it is focused on the light-duty passenger vehicle market, and it's all sorts of confusing for that market. I won't get into that here. It's quite a bit more straightforward for commercial uses. There are tax credits that are available for up to $7,500 for a vehicle that has a gross vehicle weight rating of less than 14,000 pounds, or up to $40,000 for those vehicles that have a GVWR over 14,000 pounds. And there are no sourcing requirements critically for those vehicles. So that's part of what makes the light duty requirements very confusing, is some of the supply chain and sourcing requirements not in place for commercial vehicles. Those incentives are also available for fuel cell electric vehicles, so hydrogen powered vehicles. There's also money in that for up to a 6% tax credit for commercial charging infrastructure, which again enables fleets to establish charging at depots. There is money in the Inflation Reduction Act, both as a production tax credit for hydrogen, as well as funding for hydrogen hubs. So essentially the production of hydrogen, which certainly can go into those fuel cell electric vehicles or even internal combustion vehicles. There's about $500 million for biofuels infrastructure, and it both extended the biodiesel tax credits through the end of 2024. They were scheduled to expire this year, and provided up to a $1 a gallon credit for ethanol. So a lot of money in the Inflation Reduction Act that's being kind of put into alternative fuels that is applicable for fleets. Last thing I'll touch on here is state action. I certainly am not going to do a survey of everything, but you may have seen California recently announce that they are banning the sale of internal combustion vehicles by 2035. That is light duty vehicles only. Heavy and medium duty vehicles, the timeline extends to 2045, so a little bit longer runway there. Plug-in hybrid and fuel cell EVs are not affected by that ban, so those would still be eligible to be sold in California. California does set regs for a lot of other states, and New York, Oregon, Washington, and Massachusetts have already announced that they're going to follow California's lead on this. There are another 13 states that may or may not follow in California's shoes on this, but certainly something that's going to impact the supply. And then there are lots of other state goals, and I'm just going to cite one here, but certainly not the only one.
Can I just sort of curtail it just a little bit? Can I just jump to Nate real quick and get him to talk a little bit what's going on? Everything you're saying is interesting, of course, and it's going to flow into what we talk about later. So just hang on to that thought. Nate, real quick, can I get you to talk a little bit about policy that you see is affecting your business opportunities? And then, you and I were talking earlier about things like charging farms and capture depots. So maybe you could jump into that real quick.
Sure, thank you for that. Yeah, a lot of what KC was referring to with the Inflation Reduction Act, and also some of the bills that went through in 2021, also under the Biden administration, they all have funding earmarked for a variety of different usages all around zero emission transportation. So, one of the bills that went through, not the IRA, but the one previous to that, I know that earmarks funds to go from what we have today, which is around 100,000 public chargers, all the way up to 500,000 over the next 7 or 8 years. So I think that's going to be very helpful as far as EV adoption is concerned. Like Casey talked about, you do have HVIP vouchers that essentially bring the cost of the vehicle down into a place where it's more on par with the combustion equivalent. And then what I'm seeing in NextEra Energy is a large renewable energy company. We own Florida Power and Light, which is a regulated utility, but they deploy capital in renewable energy infrastructure projects every year, up to about $10 billion. So what we're seeing with large commercial and industrial clients that are looking to electrify is there's some issues with the supply chain on the vehicles, but for right now, because of that they're not available in mass, they're focused on the areas where there is the most grant and incentive and tax credit funding. So those typically are states like California, New York, and New Jersey.
Right on. Now, I'm going to jump to Laurel real quick. And Laurel's interesting because she is not in the electric realm. In fact, she's in the biofuel realm. And Laurel, I just want to preempt this a little bit because there actually is a question from the audience that talks a little bit about focus on CNG and LNG. So maybe as you give your description of opportunities that you're seeing in your space, you just touch on that really quick. And then we'll get into the discussion a little bit further on.
I think that there are some applications that electric vehicles aren't well suited for, like maintenance work, long haul. And I believe that everyone should be recognizing that climate change is a problem. And that's why we're having this whole discussion. And we need to transition away from petroleum-based fuels. And compressed natural gas is extremely clean. In my associate's degree, I specialized in automotive emissions. And so we talk about all this electric, but they're kind of pigeonholing themselves into one technology. And I think that that's going to be a problem when we get into intermodal compatibility between states, between California and Mexico. And I see a lot of opportunity for locally produced fuels, such as waste management companies. A lot of them are sequestering compostables, putting them through anaerobic digesters, and then running their dump trucks off of them, which these are considered carbon negative fuels because they're taking carbon that would otherwise be emitted into the atmosphere, and they're emitting less carbon by turning them into fuels than they would be just rotting in a landfill. And these technologies are inherently very low NOx. And so I think that like looking at these alternatives as solutions for where electric is ill-suited is a good opportunity.
Right. Okay. All right. Thank you, Laurel. So John, real quick, can you just talk a little bit about the opportunities that you're seeing in your space?
Sure. So Casey and Nate did a really good job, I think, with background. Washington State, I understand, I'm not a policy expert, but I think Washington State actually is 2030 for the end of ICE vehicle sales, passenger vehicles. I also want to mention that there are renewable energy credits available for creating energy by wind and solar. Also there is a low carbon fuel standard that is available in some states, the Western states, California, Oregon, Washington, and I think Canada, some parts of Canada, at least BC, are participating in that as well, which really has some economic tailwinds for companies that are doing things like we are.
Right. Okay. Now, I was going to start this conversation with talking about the tools that are available to help guide a company into fuel diversity. But I'm going to start someplace else because I'm listening to all you. It's incredibly fascinating. I'm putting myself in the shoes of an enterprise that's out there. Let's say it's a small to medium enterprise. And I go, how on earth are we supposed to navigate our way through all this regulations, through all this legislation, all these new technologies? There's a ton of stuff. Like there's only 3.4 of us talking about this. And even right now, I'm a little bit confused. So tell the audience, how is it that someone starts to dip their toe into this and effectively navigate their way through all this legislation and regulation? and like the credits, all the opportunities. Who wants to go?
So I guess I'll jump in on this, and I think the key thing is finding a partner that you can trust to help you navigate this. And there are a lot of utilities, both natural gas utilities and electric utilities, that have people whose job it is to help fleets navigate transition, whether it's to an electric or a CNG kind of fleet or a mixed fuel fleet. And kind of thinking about it, you really need someone that can help you understand how your fleet is used, duty cycle, and things like that, and what specific application is going to work best for you as you're thinking about, what do you implement within the fleet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I-
Hey, what's
I
your?
would-
Oh,
I
I'm
would
sorry,
add-
John. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I would add to that, I think, especially for smaller operators, one of the best things you can do is just get started and try something. Just get one rig and see how it works and learn about it. And, there's nothing like actually doing something if you are sort of paralysis by analysis and thinking about things too much for too long. You're going to really miss out on some of the richness that you can develop internally by actually experimenting. So, acquire one vehicle and get started with it. See what the challenges are, see what the opportunities are. I've been driving Teslas for 10 years, and I can tell you that there's a lot more to the difference between EV and ICE vehicles than meets the eye. There's a lot to it, and just by doing it, you learn a lot of things. So I would suggest just pick something and get started.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, John. I mean, a pilot program is typically how all fleets that I've worked with have gotten started. And so it's usually a small portion of vehicles that are readily identifiable that, hey, these, as far as duty cycle and range and what we need every day for them to do, be successful, you start there. There are companies out there, and I will just mention this, the EIQ Mobility is part of NextEra Energy, and that's exactly what they do. Is they start and they basically doing a full analysis of your fleet. They look at your daily routes, departure times, return times, what types of vehicles you're using, what types of duty cycles those vehicles are operating under, the speed that they're traveling every single day. And then there's also an analysis of the facilities. So if you do install charging infrastructure at a facility, what, if any, type of upgrades need to be made, interconnectivity with the grid. So it does get complex. And I would just point out that there are companies, and it's at the utility level and also independent consultants that can basically kind of take you through all of these steps and then provide a game plan and a path forward if you choose to go down it.
Right. Laurel, by comparison, do you feel like sort of transitioning to biofuels or other types of more natural fuels that it's relatively easy? We're talking about technologies that a lot of companies are already familiar with, and it's not such a huge step. So how would you sort of couch those two things?
Well, I think that a lot of it depends on what your application are. There's some applications that EV is better suited for, but then there's a lot of applications where it's not. So that needs to be considered. And also there's the availability of the technology. Like through the past, there's been more of a push towards biofuels, and then the administration will change and they'll change direction. And they'll say, okay, well, now we want to go all electric. And I think that that's a mistake. I think that they need to be ramping up all near zero technologies at the same time, instead of just putting all of their eggs in one electric vehicle basket. The state of California, in their scoping plan, they cite the University of California's Institute of Transportation studies, the Driving California Transportation Emissions to Zero. That's the name of the study. But they don't follow the advice given in the study, where the advice is like, well, we need to be ramping up all zero emission technologies. So for like renewable diesel, for example, it's a drop in fuel. It requires no change of the behaviors of consumers. And there's enough renewable diesel refineries in the permitting phase to completely phase out all the diesel in California by 2025. This is 90% less emissions But California says we don't want to invest in this. We only want to invest in electric vehicles. But I think that would, if we can have 90% less emissions within 2 years with no change in consumers, that's a lot easier than trying to get 40 million people to change over their vehicles.
Sure. But what I hear you say though, is it's still a change. So the question that we're focused, at least right now, on answering is, as a company goes through this process of evaluating and figuring out which pathway to take or which pathways, when it comes to these more natural fuels, is it the same? Like, do they not still have to go do a lot of homework? I know you've called it a drop-in fuel, but it's a change or a departure from what they do on a day-to-day basis. So how easy or hard is it?
Well, for the companies, if it's a drop-in fuel and it's just a different fuel in the pump, it's not that much of a different fuel. Like, I was talking to this one woman and she had her whole fleet. She's in San Jose. So we're more rural. We're up in Chico, California. But down in San Jose, it's available. And she was running her whole fleet on it. And she said it was costing her $3.25 a gallon, like compared to regular diesel prices. So for her, it's an advantage.
Right.
If you can get it. And the refineries can switch over to making this. It doesn't require building new facilities. It just requires where we get our resources from to change.
So I'm going to throw this out to the group, just a question. Certainly there's benefits to everything that everybody has talked about. So Casey, whether, it's you talking about these new incentives that are going to be there, John and Nate, we're talking about new technologies. Laurel, we're talking about, convenience. How long does it take for the technologies or the fuel diversity that each of you are part of to be realized by a company? Is this something they're going to see overnight, or is this something they have to invest in for the next decade? How's it all sort of, flowing out?
So I would answer that question by saying 15 years ago, we saw the first iPhone. Today, everyone on the planet has one. 10 years ago, the first Tesla came out, and now we're seeing the knee on the S curve. So my prediction is over the next 10 years, we are going to see an extremely rapid rise in electrification. And as that happens, I think we're going to see the entire industry become that much more concerned about missing the boat and jumping in. So it's going to accelerate. So I would say that over the next 10 years, you're going to certainly see massive adoption on the lighter end of the spectrum. The heavy duty freight is perhaps longer than that, although ports in California are already, in fact, West Coast ports are already mandating by 2030 zero emission. So that probably will help drive that.
Right. Well, John, it begs the question, though, I can already hear the audience sort of throwing it out there. They go, hey, if everything's going to change so rapidly over the next 10 years, then why would I hedge my bets on one technology, or why would I invest now? Because like the iPhone, next year it's just going to change on me.
Well, it's a good question, and things are going to change rapidly. But again, you start taking advantage of technologies when they become available. I mean, it's like saying, when you look at the productivity increases that were gained by adopting computing technologies, if you waited until you got the best PC, you'd still be waiting because they get better every year, right?
Because Mac is better than PC? Is that what you're saying? No, I'm just
This year's better than last year, right?
Yeah. Others, you want to jump in on that? Why not wait? Because to John's point, things are going to change. What would you say?
Yeah, so I guess what I would say, and Laurel sort of alluded to it before, but part of even whether it's a drop-in or whether it's a different powertrain technology altogether, there are some different operating characteristics that also impact TCO, which is very important to fleet owners. And both John and Nate made the point earlier of just get started, do a pilot program, start learning about it. And that's really the way to start validating some of the assumptions around TCO as it applies to your specific fleet. And the way that you can plan for that transition over time. If you wait and all of a sudden it's forced on you, it's going to be a much more brutal transition.
Good point.
Nate, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would just add to that. As far as the vehicles are concerned, typically a manufacturer, it's going to take around 5 years for them to bring a totally new vehicle to market. So they have already stopped investing in combustion powertrains and moved in the direction of electrification. So it's going to be interesting on the adoption side, because essentially you're going to be oversupplying a market that last year was 3% of all new sales, and this year looks to be about 5%. So that there is that element from the manufacturing side. But I also would just point out that some of the reason that companies don't start right now and jump all in, and I'm talking about the larger fleets especially, is because this is an unproven technology. The people that are making these decisions, like the fleet manager, there's a lot of risk involved in making this leap when nobody else has. It's a lot easier to be a fast follower than as an early adopter. And if things go haywire and they don't work out, whether it's that fleet manager's fault or circumstances that were out of his or her control, it's their job and their reputation on the line. And so that's part of what I see is some hesitancy to move forward. They want to see how it works for others that are in their space.
Right. Laurel, talk to me a little bit about regulation and legislation that we see that's non-EV or non-electric related. What's out there?
Well, they're the low carbon fuel standards. I think somebody brought that up earlier. So that is that's the California program for the alternative fuels. I wanted to talk about the when we were talking about the early adoption, and so the Port of Oda Mesa sent a letter to California Air Resource Board, and they said, just because you're doing an electric vehicle mandate in your state doesn't mean that us in Mexico agree with that, and we don't think that that's the best technology. And so they're telling the state of California that they're refusing to adopt it, and that they believe that hydrogen is going to be what they want to invest in. And so they're saying that they're going to wait and build up their infrastructure to support hydrogen ICEs and hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicles. And so that's where we come into the compatibility between states and countries and stuff that has to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. And it also speaks to a larger issue, which actually just popped up from the audience as one of the audience questions, which is this idea, so they throw out some statistics. It says market share of iOS is 55.45%, Android's 44.23%. Don't we need some diversity? And you're speaking to that. So, now we can think about hydrogen, we can think about hydrogen combustion, we can think about biofuels, we can think about EV. So again, a question to everybody: does the market not need this sort of widespread diversity, a bunch of different options, rather than this more polar attitude towards EV and everything else? Doesn't that make more sense for the marketplace?
And I also think that consumers are more likely to adopt near zero technologies if they're given a range of options. If you try and tell a consumer, oh, you're forced to adopt this one technology. We come from 8 miles from Paradise, the town was burnt down in the campfire, and a lot of those people affected by that area don't want EVs because they feel like PG&E, the utilities company around here, burnt down their houses. But if you gave them other options, a lot of people would adopt a lot easier, I believe.
So, Gregory, I think there are two things to look at in response to that question. One is the use case, right? So Laurel's pointed it out already, but the fact that if you're talking like Class 8 long haul trucking, EV's probably not the answer today, or at least not without some very significant compromises. Whereas other use cases, EV is absolutely the answer, right? So, assessing that is one really key piece. I think the other piece to look at is fuel availability. And just a couple of things to consider on that. One is, electricity is relatively ubiquitous. It's everywhere. That being said, there are certainly some grid challenges. I think, Nate alluded to it before about, making sure that there's enough capacity on the grid to serve a depot, for instance. So those are very real challenges that need to be addressed when thinking about, are you going to go all EV? Renewable natural gas, The latest study that I saw said that if we tapped all of the available feedstock in the US, it could displace about 20% of the existing natural gas use. So it is absolutely a technology that is viable, but it's not something that's going to scale beyond what our current natural gas kind of capacity is. Again, sort of thinking about, that availability. And it's different in different parts of the country, by the way. And then last but not least, thinking about hydrogen, there's no source to go mine hydrogen. You've got to make it. Either you're doing steam reformation of natural gas or you're doing electrolysis of water. There is a lot of money that's going into that from the federal government, and there are some solutions that work for fleets that are on site, but it's not really been scaled yet. So the availability of hydrogen for either internal combustion or fuel cell is quite a bit more limited right now. So those are kind of the two things to look at, is use case and then fuel availability.
Others, what are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on this need or requirement for diversity to help the market grow?
Well, I think thermal, in other words, combustion of hydrogen is not as efficient. Thermal is not as efficient as electric. So the fuel cell and the battery are the two primary options that I think look like they're going to win over the longer term. And I think hydrogen is the challenge. There's obviously some benefits to hydrogen, but it's, I think if you're a fleet operator that's got Class 8s today, you don't really have a lot of choices. There's a lot of things that are coming out. I was just at Testival, which is the testing interaction between vehicles and charging companies. And there's a lot of vehicles that are coming out, but there's really nothing of scale in the market yet. And I think that you're either going to have charging or hydrogen fueling, one of those two challenges. And in the short run, hydrogen is primarily being made out of fossil fuels. So we're really not gaining a lot there.
Nate, thoughts?
Yeah, I thought KC laid it out really well. I mean, you have a use case and then you have availability of fuel. Just to add another comment or opinion, if you will. I mean, I think that the reason you're seeing so much emphasis on the electric vehicle and not on other forms of energy right now is I think it's just sort of it's all the rage. Tesla has become extremely popular. And it's also, electrification has become very, very popular, in political circles. We're in an election cycle coming up. And so I think that there's a lot of emphasis and spotlight has been placed on the EV because of that. Now, it has been backed up with massive, massive investment by the automakers to move into this technology. So I do know that the automakers are also looking at the hydrogen fuel cell because of battery capacities and things like that, and scarcity of materials that go into that. So I know that it's in conjunction with the electric vehicle, but I'm of the opinion that over time, a mix of technologies is going to be the right solution.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. And one of the things I wanted to bring up, and it's something that John was just mentioning, about how some of these technologies, and Casey actually was bringing it up too. In fact, all of you were, but when it comes to availability, when it comes to production, when it comes to adoption of some of these technologies, it's certainly EV has taken the lead. But it sort of begs the question if it's not self-determining. The fact that everybody is heading in one direction means that all the investment goes that way and all the attention goes that way. And we know that regulation is driving, especially from a commercial perspective, regulation is driving a lot of this adoption, actually, even from a non-commercial application. So, the question, it sort of we come to this question, which I have here, which is, because so much of the policy is regulation, because so much of the adoption is policy and regulation led, to what degree does the market truly have discretion in saying, yeah, I know that you're saying that this is the way to go, but this is the way that we prefer, whether it be based on use case or some other preference? How much discretion is there, and how much should there be?
Well, fleets are driven by economics, and we talked about TCO, total cost of ownership, earlier. I think that's really the primary way that fleets make decisions, because it is such an economically sensitive industry. There may be some benefits attributed to a more environmentally friendly solution, But at the end of the day, the economics have to be close. So I think that, regulation is absolutely going to play an important role in making those decisions. And this is one place where regulations really are getting the intended effect, I think.
I think that the regulations are only effective, they're only as effective as they are implementable. And so I was I don't know if you know this, but right now the California Air Resource Board is passing the Advanced Clean Fleets regulation, which is where I would be if I wasn't here. And that's the regulation for Class 8 vehicles to go to all electric. But so recently, back in 2018, they passed a regulation for all transportation to go to fully battery electric. And then at the last board meeting, they had a check-in with it. And the transportation agencies reported back, if you make us do this, we're up against a cliff. You're not going to have public transportation because we can't meet your goal. And so then the discussion becomes at the Air Resource Board meeting, well, what do we have to do if we have to rescind this regulation? What does that look like? And they're having this conversation. And I think that when they come up to backstops and they come into things like ODM SA or people who won't buy electric vehicles, because some people won't, a lot of people will, and they're a great solution for a lot of people, but then they're going to have to rethink them if they're not actually practical and implementable. They can't really stop people from buying used vehicles out of state and bringing them into state. They can regulate them here in the state, but there's going to be problems with that.
Casey, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think John really framed it nicely, and kind of looking at the market. I'm a markets guy, right? Like, I think we set kind of the overall framework. This is where we want to go, and I think Laurel mentioned it earlier that it's we want zero emissions, right? Like, that's the ultimate goal here. And then it's the question of like, what's the technology? Well, we let markets decide around that. And a lot of the policy that's been put in place is essentially helping buy down the cost of various technologies. So it's making that TCO for some of these alternative powertrains more cost effective. To me, that's a little bit more effective. I mean, still meddling in market decisions, but allowing the market actors to make choices. But it's more effective than mandating and saying, okay, everything must be electric or everything must be fuel cell. At the same time, I do think that there's something to be said around the experience curve and the fact that we've been producing so many batteries that we're starting to build up expertise in servicing battery electric vehicles. And in some regards, that is different from servicing a fuel cell electric vehicle. There are some things that are similar, certainly. But those kinds of things where you're going down the experience curve for either manufacturing costs, as in with batteries, or within the end user and their ability to service that, ultimately is probably going to drive a lot of the decision making because you have the other technologies that end up being outliers either from cost or expertise.
Yeah, but aren't we back to that same point where those other technologies don't get any airtime and they don't get any attention because all of the capital and resources have been thrown into one main technology, which is EV. So it's almost like they don't get their shot to be effective.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. I don't know if the audience is aware of this, but when you look at a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, that is a battery electric vehicle with hydrogen providing some of the charging to the batteries. And so the size of the hydrogen fuel cell and the size of the battery dictates the performance of the vehicle. But so it's kind of a hybrid, if you will, in and of itself.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, something I want to talk about, and Laurel talked about this earlier, is this idea of regulation across boundaries. So from state to state, and we've seen this. This is the landscape of the US, whether we're talking politics or so demographics or anything else. But from state to state, it's almost like every state's its own little country. Every region is its own little state. So how is it that we're going to effectively manage the benefits that should be allowable to all these companies when from one state line to another, things change so dramatically?
Well, I think there's a saying that as California goes, so goes the world. California is overtaking Germany as the #4 economy right now. And so when you have a state like California that makes decisions, it affects the industry whether the other states want it or not, it doesn't really even matter because the entire industry is affected. It's such a huge market that it causes markets to move. And so that's why California leads so many different decisions.
Yeah, Laurel, you talked about this yesterday when we had a conversation, right? You were talking about the influence of CARB.
Yeah, and they still have to get like the Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation, which was the one for passenger cars going to all electric. That still hasn't been approved by the EPA. So we don't know if that's actually going to go into effect or not. That's still up in the air. So
what you had mentioned yesterday, you're saying that the CARB regulations are so stringent that it's sort of a precursor to how other regulatory bodies sort of conceptualize what they should be doing or might be doing in the future.
Well, there's actually a little bit of history with that, and I'll try and keep it brief. But the the Clean Air Act was passed in 1968, right in that time frame. But CARB was established before that, and so they were written into the Clean Air Act that they had an exception that they could set their own rules, but no other state was allowed to set their own rules. And so other states can either follow California standards or follow federal standards, and those are called 177 states. Prior to the Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation, there were 17 other 177 states. At least 4 states have dropped the standard and gone back to federal standards in response to the electric vehicle mandate, and those other 13 states that Casey was saying may adopt them are still up in the air whether they're going to. At least 4 definitely are going to adopt the so that's where California has a whole bunch of influence over other people due to that history.
Okay. Nate, did you have a point of view on this, on this idea that from state to state things might change so dramatically? So how is a business supposed to manage that effectively? Or how do they take advantage of what should be opportunities?
Yeah, well, I mean, as far as the last point you just made, taking advantage of opportunities, what I hear from a lot of large fleets that have vehicles in every state nationwide is we're going to start, if there's money and incentives and offsets to be had, which there are, then we're going to take advantage of those first. And I just feel like unless there's some type of a federal mandate one day, if it is state by state, then the fleet operators that have vehicles in all lower 48, if you will, or a majority of them will just make business decisions based on what's in their best interest in those particular locations. And it may not be just limited to, is there a tax credit or is there something that offsets the charging cost? It could just be that, you know, in the middle of Montana, an electric vehicle is not a real viable option for whatever they happen to be doing. And so I just think that flexibility, I still believe is necessary in a country as big and as vast as we are, especially with the types of, you know, when you think about fleets in general, I mean, there are thousands of usage applications, and I don't believe that all of them can be served by one single source of energy as far as vehicle power.
Yeah, it's a great point. I have an anecdote for you. Just a quick diversion. I'll take 30 seconds to tell it. So I live in California, you know, south of LA, and I'm sitting at a stoplight, and I say, I look in front of me, there's a Tesla. I look beside me, there's a Tesla. I look behind me, there's a Tesla. So I go, okay, let me count how many electric vehicles I see between now and the next stoplight, which is, I don't know, maybe 300 feet away, right? Okay, so I count, guess how many I saw? Guess how many I counted? 19 in one stoplight. Okay, and then I'm talking to someone and they're in, I think they're in Idaho. And he said, oh yeah, like we might see 19 in a week where he is located. I saw him in one stoplight. So Nate, your point is well taken. A lot of this depends on where you are and what does the infrastructure look like and the availability of those technologies.
Yeah, and Gregory, if I can just kind of add to that. So I'm located in the Southeast, and you know, I mentioned earlier that the availability of feedstock for renewable natural gas varies a lot around the country, and we got a lot of feedstock for it. So here in Georgia, we got a lot of chicken litter. In North Carolina, there's a lot of hog waste. But bottom line, that can all be turned into renewable natural gas. And we've got on the coast in Georgia, we've got a lot of ports. And so the state and some private actors have invested in CNG fueling for the ports. And because the renewable natural gas is able to be, mixed with or substituted for CNG, I mean, that's kind of a pathway for cleaning transportation here in the Southeast. That's not necessarily something that is available in a state like, say, Kentucky, right? That doesn't have the same level of agricultural waste that can be turned into RNG.
Right, right. That's a great point. Actually, so Casey, great point. Let's take that a little bit forward. And maybe each of you can talk a little bit about this idea of technologies, like how these different fuel types can effectively coexist. Because as you mentioned, whether it's use case or location or business type, there isn't one particular solution. So do you guys have a vision for how these things can effectively sort of coalesce?
I can start just by pointing out that there are some fleets right now that are fully electric. If you think about like black car, taxi, and then you get into some of the last mile delivery type companies. They have defined routes. They know exactly how far they're going to go every day. And they also have conveniently vehicles that are available now that will perform that duty cycle for them today. So passenger vehicles, SUVs, sedans, things of that nature. I honestly am a believer in the hydrogen fuel cell technology for larger trucks that are going station to station or depot to depot, not over the road where they could be gone for weeks at a time, but are going between distribution centers. And I believe in the technology because it allows you to have a smaller battery pack and still have that same range. And then you would have the fueling stations on either end. Mm-hmm. So I think that there's a real opportunity there on the heavier duty trucks.
Right. Yep. Laurel, what are your thoughts on this?
I think that there may be an adjustment period, but in the future, you might not, like now we're used to having like one fuel type, right? You go to a gas station and that's it. You get gas or you get diesel. Sure, maybe it's like, well, if you own this type of vehicle, you go here to fill up, or if you own that type of vehicle, you go somewhere else to fill up. And we might not have a singular solution anymore. So I think that they can coexist and that different technologies aren't mutually exclusive.
Right. Casey, any thoughts on this?
I mean, I think that's right. What Laurel said is that, they are going to coexist. I think it's going to be a messy transition in terms of like what percentage of the fleet has what powertrain technology. I am bullish on electric as kind of winning out at the end of the day, whether it's battery electric or fuel cell electric. But that being said, I mean, again, I think it is a market thing, and each individual fleet owner is going to need to make decisions based on, the nature of their fleet and their business and the kinds of fuels that they can get. And Laurel's exactly right. They can coexist. You might have local delivery that's purely electric and over the road that's hydrogen fuel cell, right? So that's okay, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, John, what do you think?
I'm a big believer in electric. I think when you look at thermal, internal combustion, it's 3 times less efficient. So electric's going to win, whether it's battery electric or hydrogen electric. And obviously that's why I'm in high-speed charging.
Obviously, yeah, I get it. Okay, so at this point, what I think I'm going to do is open it up to questions from the audience. I do have some more questions in the meantime, but I'll keep my eye on the chat to see what sorts of things come through. One thing I do want to address, so again, everything that you guys have said is fascinating and relevant. It does speak to this idea of mindset, though. And Laurel just touched on it where she said, hey, we're so used to one fuel type, maybe two. Like maybe if we go, okay, there's diesel and there's, regular gas, maybe alternative gas, but we're so linear in the way that we think about things that it sounds like part of this is actually educating the end user or end consumer on ways of thinking differently, ways of managing their fleet differently, but still being the same, if not more effective. What do you think about that?
I think go try it. I think that's how you learn. So, back to the same thing, go try it. You will learn things and you will make your own decision. I mean, living with EV, one of the cool things about it is you find out that you actually don't visit any kind of fueling station most of the time if you're fortunate enough to have your own charging infrastructure at home.
Yeah. Casey, you looked like you were going to say something.
Yeah, no, I think John hit the nail on the head there, right? Go try it and learn about it. What I was going to say is that, from a TCO standpoint, it is a shift in mindset. So to vastly oversimplify it, doing something like converting a fleet to EV is basically trading capital, upfront CapEx for lower ongoing OpEx, right? And in many cases, TCO is lower, but it's a different sort of calculation than most fleet buyers are kind of used to making. So getting someone, getting that expertise, talking to someone who's been there can be really helpful as you're making those kinds of decisions.
Mm-hmm. I was just at the American Trucking Association conference in San Diego this weekend. And the great thing about that conference is that you get industry suppliers, you get OEs, you get owner operators, you get everybody there. And there was a panel that they were talking about different fuel types, including hydrogen amongst other fuel types. And, they made it pretty clear that nothing has been defined. Everything's in a state of transition. So, but to sort of stay the course, because it's all gonna come together at some point. From a business perspective, you have to wonder though, and I hear what you guys are saying. You say, hey, you know what, you gotta jump in at some point. But from a business perspective, you go, yeah, but what happens? Like, where am I supposed to get the capital to switch over a couple of vehicles? How are they gonna acclimatize to this? Do I have to put in charging? How much is that gonna cost? What about rates? There's a lot of things that I could easily see a business saying, yeah, it sounds great, but just even that little step is actually a huge step. So maybe the question to you guys is, I hear what you're saying. How do you go about convincing someone that that's the right thing to do?
You gain confidence by experience. And that's why I say either buy one or lease one or rent one, but get some experience, because when you have the firsthand experience of how it works, you gain the confidence to know what the right decisions are for your operation.
Okay. Others?
And sometimes that experience might lead you to know what you don't want also.
Absolutely.
I'm sure a bunch of people whose vehicles are burning down in Florida right now probably don't want to buy a second one. I don't know if you've seen that on the news, the vehicles that were affected by the hurricane that got wet, when they dry out, the battery packs are shorting out and they're having problems with vehicles that were affected by the hurricane now spontaneously combusting. And I think what John's doing is really important, because 20% of EV owners say they won't buy another one. And that's because of the charging infrastructure and the time it takes to charge. People want something quick that can, they can fill up at the gas station. And, it is great for some people. My next door neighbor's on full solar and she has an EV and she doesn't pay for fuel ever. And it's great for her. And that's a great solution for her.
Truly zero emission.
Well, it is.
Don't get her started, John. We only have 6 minutes left.
Well, it's wheel-to-well emissions, and so you have to consider the whole life cycle emissions,
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, Casey, go ahead.
Well, actually, I was going to kind of tee Nate up here, because I was going to say, we work a lot with utilities at Escalant, and one of the things that we talk about in relation to businesses is exactly the question that you pose, right? Which is, businesses are kind of increasingly thinking about things like sustainability and climate. Fleet is part of that. It's, the questions that they have, the unknowns. They're looking for a partner that can help them with answers, right? They don't necessarily, particularly a smaller business, doesn't necessarily have that expertise in-house. And so we've been talking a lot to our utility clients of, hey, you really need to take that more consultative approach with your business customers and help them understand what this looks like. And so Nate, that's what I was going to tee you up for. And hopefully that's a good tee up, because it sounds like that's part of what you're doing within the broader NextEra umbrella.
Yeah, that's correct. Again, NextEra, we own Florida Power Lights. So we've got a utility. So we've got all the people that understand interconnectivity with the grid, scaling up, things of that nature. We've installed thousands of EV chargers. But again, having a partner that can start by doing an evaluation on the fleet and understanding what you're doing with the vehicle, where it's being parked or domiciled in the evening, how many miles it's driving per day, and when, at the depot, when will it be parked? How many of those vehicles are there? And then just sort of back into it and provide yourself a game plan. There is consideration that has to be made at the facility level for upgrades with switch gear and transformers and things of that nature. And then being able to do the interconnectivity with the grid. Most fleet operators are not adept at doing all of these things. And so you need a partner that can help you navigate these waters, especially when it comes to the regulated utilities. You're going to need more energy. Understanding how to buy it and how to acquire it at a cost-effective position is massive. It's forecasting major costs, like you said, trading your operational expenditures are supposed to go down, but you have to do it right on the front end in order to make that happen.
Right, Nate. So just to follow up on that thought, I mean, it sounds great from sort of from a business perspective, having someone in your corner who can effectively do an assessment and help you think a little bit more about what opportunities exist for your business sounds great. Do you feel like in the future that sort of more consultative approach is going to become more popular, or is it still sort of going to be, you guys are on your own, make your choices?
Well, if I'm a fleet manager or I'm a business owner and I have a fleet management partner, like an FMC partner, I would be looking to them to have some type of skin in the game to be able to lead us down this path. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of the FMCs are looking at that, but they're not nearly as adept as some of the other consultative businesses like EIQ Mobility and some of the others that are out there. I think it's a growth market, in my opinion, for companies to get in that space and help fleet operators make those evaluations and those good business decisions going forward. Because right now we're in uncharted waters. There's not a ton of fleets that have actually done this. So there's not an established game plan and beaten path.
Right. John, do you see that too? Do you see a more consultative space developing in the future?
Absolutely. And I think for, especially for freight fleets, even the charging standards aren't even really set yet. They're being set now. So we're looking at maybe the end of 2 years from now, 24, start seeing megawatt charging. So there's still some time until that really becomes reality.
Right. Okay. We have approximately 1 minute left. I'll just open it up. Are there any other comments or things that people have said that maybe you want to throw out there without telling your own businesses too hard?
You had said about if you think that consultations will be important in the future, but as we move into more diversity, I think they'll be more important because people need to understand the options.
Right. No, that makes perfect sense. Casey, you were going to say something?
Nope, I was just agreeing with Laurel.
Oh, okay. Right on. Well, on that note, I don't think I see any specific questions per se from the audience. So I think we're going to wrap it up. I want to thank all of you for being here today and putting out your comments. I think it was a great discussion. I was kind of expecting this to be an MMA match, whereas us versus them, but it didn't turn out that way. I think it was more productive than I ever imagined. So thank you all for being here and having a great point of view, and hopefully the audience took something really positive away from this. If anybody in the audience has any questions for anybody on this panel, then you can reach them, through the chat or through the website, and feel free to reach out to everybody who you see here today. So thank you so much, and I guess we'll catch up with you guys later.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gregory.
Thank you.
Thanks, panelists.